Good afternoon and namaste. Welcome to our 8th Patanjali lecture series. As Dr. Singh gave you an introduction yesterday, we started this series in 2002 with the express intent that it was the desire of the faculty who are affiliated with the Center for Indic Studies that we should do something which would be an expression of our gratitude to this academic community. Now, academic community, when I say it's not necessarily universities of today, we are talking of a tradition which has endured for more than 2,000 years. So it's in that sentiment. So in that sentiment, the name that comes foremost is that of Patanjali. He was one of the earliest academicians, teachers. So we decided to honor this lecture series in his name, and it is a very prestigious speaker series that we have once every year, typically in April or May. And as I said, now the word Patanjali speaker does not mean that the speaker always has to speak of the main contribution of Patanjali that we understand to be as kind of the writer of Yoga Sutras. It's a treatise on yogas. But our interest is very eclectic because we try to represent facets of Indic knowledge system which span across the whole spectrum of human existence. So our speakers have come from the sciences background, of course, definitely from philosophy and psychology and political science. So in that vein, today we have Professor Ramakrishna Rao. Some of you who had the chance to hear him yesterday, I can say on behalf of them, sir, that they were really fascinated by this distillation of this entire corpus of Indian psychology and philosophy in a 1-hour lecture. So that was very informative for us. Today he will speak on a similar subject, but his, as Dr. Singh said yesterday, it's a little informal, it is more interactive. Today it will be more formal, and he will talk of the centrality of consciousness. I will now request Jerry Solfin, who is our main seminar series coordinator, to introduce our speaker for today. Jerry?
Thank you, Suku. As usual, I'll have some announcements before we actually begin. There are a few materials that I think most of you have seen, but I just want to make sure you have seen them. They're on the table behind you. We have a small brochure that was quickly made up for today's lecture, and please avail yourself of one of those. And we will eventually, soon, publish the entire text of the talk that we hear today in one of these brochures. And we have last year's Patanjali lecture, which was given by Dr. Francis Clooney, and we have that one completed and hopefully we'll have Dr. Rao's before next year. I want to also give you a visual aid. This will be show and tell. This is a book that I forgot to bring last night, but I did want to show you a copy. This is the Indic Studies Center copy of the Handbook of Indian Psychology, which is edited by Dr. Rao and his colleagues Anand Paranjave and Ajit Dalal. It's an excellent book, and we recommend it. You're going to have a hard time borrowing this one because, as you can see, it's already very well used, and it's currently in use. But I did want to give you have a look at what the cover looks like. Now, it's with great pride that I introduce to you, and I'll make it a very quick introduction, to Dr. K. Ramakrishna Rao. I've known Dr. Rao for many years, more than he and I probably care to talk about. But I'm just delighted that he could make it for this, all the way from India. He shares his time currently between two occupations, and as director and founder and director of the Institute for Human Science and Service in Andhra Pradesh, India. And the other half of his year is spent in Delhi, where he is the chairs the Indian Council of Philosophical Research, a very prestigious position for those of you who are not familiar with Indian government. In any case, he is the author of many articles, over 200 research articles, 12 books, and more coming. As a matter of fact, before the lecture's over, we might have a few more from him. In any case, I will leave my introduction at that. Please welcome warmly Dr. K. Ramakrishna Rao, our 2009 Patanjali lecturer.
Thank you, Jerry. And thank you for all those connected with Indic Center at this university, Professor Balram Singh, and the rest of the faculty. I'm very grateful to you for inviting me to be here yesterday and today. And I consider it as a great privilege. And I understand that the Patanjali lecture can be on any topic, but I'm so pleased that this time the Patanjali lecture is going to be almost about Patanjali. What I'm going to speak to you today is derived essentially from the groundwork of Patanjali, which I think has a very significant model to understand who we are and what is the goal that we must seek and how we may achieve that goal. So that makes me particularly happy about it. Those of you who have reflected on the progress of knowledge cannot really fail to recognize the tremendous asymmetry between physical sciences and human sciences. We have made tremendous progress in understanding the physical forces, in controlling the physical forces, in channeling physical forces to our benefit, with, of course, the risks attached to it. But then, when it comes to understand ourselves, we did make some progress, but that progress compared to the progress that is made in physical science is extremely insignificant. So this asymmetry or this gap in the knowledge of outside world and the knowledge about ourselves, I think is the main problem. And this main problem is partly because of the failure to deal with the hard problems of human science. We are attempting to deal with those problems that are easy to research, easy to talk about, easy to investigate, which have access, easy access for instrumentation, observation, and recording, ignoring those very crucial aspects that are too complex to analyze, that are too subtle to lay our hands on, and possibly is too difficult to observe them without some kind of a training and practice. So, we have come to a point today that this gap is going to threaten the very existence of our species on this planet. For, as we see every day, terror, identity conflicts of all sorts, violence, and this potential to unleash vast amounts of violence without facing the consequences in one's own consciousness, conscience. It is a very serious threat. And on my own part, I'm attempting to see this from the perspective of a psychologist. What has gone wrong with psychology? Why is it psychology has left out and ignored some of the very basic issues concerning ourselves, focusing more on those with which we can easily deal? So this makes it necessary to enlarge the scope of the inquiry in psychology. Yesterday, last evening, I attempted to give you a broad synopsis and outline of the principles that should govern this new model. And today, I will attempt to present to you in somewhat of a crude form, in this very elementary, modest way, this new model, which I call the body-mind consciousness model of the person. Please bear with me. Contemporary psychology is essentially biocentric. You may accept it or not, that's where it is. Its widely shared assumptions are that the person is a brain-driven machine, and that one's achievements and actions, beliefs and behavior, cognition and conduct, can be studied scientifically and understood in their entirety, following the machine model within the mechanistic framework. Machine model or a computational model. Indeed, during the past several decades, psychology has made rapid strides, giving credibility to the claim that human thought, passion, and action are ultimately reducible to what goes on in one's brain. In fact, these great achievements are, in a sense, impediments, because you think you have succeeded, and therefore there is no need to revise or look back. Notwithstanding the enormous gains in our understanding of human nature made by the neurocentric reductionism, there are glaring gaps in our knowledge of the way humans think, feel, and act. And these, in principle, appear to be uncomfortably unbridgeable, and consequently call for bold initiatives for developing more inclusive models. Now, what are these? First, consciousness in the sense of subjectivity is largely left out by the mainstream psychology. This is so because, it would seem, consciousness is simply not accessible for third-person observation. And there is an intrinsic explanatory gap in the attempt to explain conscious subjectivity in computational terms. Notwithstanding the many heroic efforts to generate artificial subjectivity in the so-called machine consciousness, I see little hope of realizing consciousness in any computational machine models, even with considerable advances in soon-to-come nanotechnology. The axiomatic rejection of inner experience and the persistent insistence of die-hard eliminationists like Dennett, Susan Blackmore, that the notion of subjectivity is conceptually confused and scientifically incoherent. This is the view of Dennett and Blackmore and people like that. Suggests to me that the crucial aspects of subjectivity may not be captured within the reductionist paradigm. I use their own argument against them. Equally unconvincing are the attempts to account for subjectivity within the computational framework in terms of hypothetical cognitive processes such as the global workspace model of Bernard Boss. And I have dealt with all this in a book which I published a few years ago called Consciousness Studies, Cross-Cultural Perspectives, which is published in this country, and I think it is still in print. Let alone the hard problems of subjectivity, Even some of the basic psychological processes themselves are not well understood and accounted for within a reductionist paradigm. These include cognitive processes like memory and genius. We pride ourselves, we know a great deal about memory. It seems to me we know those aspects of memory which are no doubt important, but those are amenable for the current models. But we have left out several things about memory which are not easily studied. Now I can quote contemporary psychologists who are working in this area. For example, Alan Gull, a British psychologist of repute. He says, and I quote, although the mainstream view of memory as purely a matter of brain function has for most persons hardened into a dogma that cannot be questioned. Hardened into a dogma that cannot be questioned. In my view, says Gall, it does not merit that status. It remains essentially a neurophysiological myth, appealing and widely shared, and woven around an impressive collection of empirical findings, but unproven. It is essentially a neurophysiological myth. A mainstream psychologist talking about it. The life and work of Indian mathematician Ramanujan illustrates that genius is markedly different from the garden variety of creativity that is largely explored in psychological research. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard about Ramanujan. Ramanujan hardly went to school. He just did his high school. And even that, I don't know whether he had completed his high school. But he had produced an enormous amount of mathematical information that needed someone from England to recognize and take him to England. And his work was published full book and many papers, and which is considered to be profoundly new in many ways, and also a good deal of his work is the rediscovery of what was already found. And how did this man, with hardly any professional mathematical training, was able to make such creative contributions to mathematics? He used to tell that in his dreams, he used to get a goddess called Namakal. And Namakal used to tell him a formula and the solution for that problem. And he will get up and write it down, and in the morning he work the details out. So there is another way you can creatively receive information than the usual method of step-by-step logical process. And this, I think, is hardly studied in today. Now, Kelly and Grasso, Kelly and colleagues brought us a book, which is a very impressive, huge volume, titled Irreducible Mind. And they deal with many of these phenomena in that book, and I quote from that book. Creative imagination on this scale, Kelly and Grasso, fairly beggars the theoretical apparatus available to contemporary cognitive science. Its associations, predicate, calculus, representations, and all the rest. We make no exception here of the recent attempt by Lakoff and Euler to account for the origins of mathematics in terms of Lakoff's more general theory of embodied cognition. So we are calling for explanations. If we move on to non-ordinary forms of consciousness, such as mystical experiences, the need for a model beyond reductionist physicalism becomes even more compelling. Again, we do no better than referring to chapter 8 on mystical experience by Kelly and Grasso. And they conclude, careful survey and and analysis of the reported experiences reveals that at the core of this domain lies a robust, deeply significant, and still mysterious psychological phenomenon. The introverted, mystical experience of pure, unitary, undifferentiated, self-reflexive consciousness. This distinction made by Stace in his classic book. The singular properties of which pose profound challenges to all mechanistic, physicalist, and computationalist theories of human mind and personality. While there is no conclusive evidence in support of reincarnation or survival of human personality after death in any recognizable form, the very fact of the existence of cognitive anomalies, along with the widespread belief in survival in different parts of the world, warrants an inclusive conception of consciousness that would leave room for the possibility of survival. Whether you believe in survival or not, I think your model must provide a place for it. If there is survival, that can be accommodated into this model. And the cognitive anomalies, I need not repeat again, they are like psychic abilities. In the Hindu terms, the siddhis, knowing what's going to happen in the future, and knowing what's going on in somebody else's mind, with other person revealing it to you, so on and so forth. Thus, a variety of phenomena of consciousness are either left out of the precincts of science today, or they are not adequately accounted for within biocentric model of the person. They call for a more inclusive model. It is the lack of this model that is preventing people researching in psychology and related disciplines into going into those areas which are so important for us to march ahead along with our physical understanding of the universe. The second line of challenges to biocentric model of person comes from, as I said, parapsychology. There is significant scientific evidence to suggest that awareness may occur without being mediated by sensory processes, as believed to be the case with extrasensory perception. The defining characteristic of an ESP experience or a psychic event is that there is no identifiable causal connection between such an experience and its presumed source, that is, the object of awareness. Also, the evidence for precognition, the ability to have non-inferential awareness of a future event, and the success of long-distance ESP experiments suggest that time and space are not limiting conditions for the occurrence of ESP. Now, those of you who are growing up in the West may have some difficulty in dealing with this kind of phenomenon. Because I recall myself and John Palmer published in Behavioral and Brain Science Journal, Cambridge University, but it's a mainstream journal in cognitive science today, a target article on parapsychology, entitled what is called psi, PSI, which is the general term used for psychic phenomena. And this was, as the practice in the journal, it was commented by about 100 scientists who were supposed to know something about it. But they are not mostly, some of them are parapsychologists, but mostly people who are outside parapsychology. And you can see the evidence that we have presented is clear-cut, but half of them said, great, there's something here, we must look. And the other half said, no, I don't think there's anything. There must be an error somewhere. There was something wrong somewhere, which we may not know at this point. In substance, that is the situation. It is because over 100 years, parapsychologists in this country and in Europe labored very hard to develop methods, to do research, beginning from Harvard, going to Stanford, Duke, and Edinburgh, and so on, with a methodology that can only say that can only say that this thing cannot happen, but it is happening. In other words, we are rejecting the null hypothesis. We are stating a null hypothesis. If I am looking at a card and you can't see the card, you cannot guess what the card is. But you do guess. Therefore, null hypothesis is rejected. But what it means, unfortunately, we know so little. With the result, people can afford to ignore. People can afford to say, there must be something wrong with your experiment. There must be some kind of a clue going from you. And therefore, I would move myself into another room. That was experiment. Get similar results. Now, you may have be sending some signals from somewhere. It must be possible. So you prevent yourself from whatever kind of a possible physical communication between the object and the person who is receiving that information. Finally, say, well, maybe somebody is cheating. So how can you deal with this? And people do cheat in science. Also, unfortunately, we have seen in physics, chemistry, biochemistry, medicine, and so on, researchers publishing papers without valid data. But to say that the whole field, over 125 years, having so many people, some of them are as good as Nobel laureates, they're all conspiring with our communication to cheat the whole world, to perpetuate a false belief, I think is improbable, to say the least. And consequently, all that we can say is, here is something, an anomaly is happening. What it means, we do not know, because we do not have a paradigm which can help you to study this phenomenon. That is the problem with parapsychology as research in this. I spent almost 50 years working in that area. Now, at the end of the road, the postscript is, well, I went on a wrong route. I went to the dead end of the road. I must make a turn to find a way out. And I think to some degree, the new model that we are attempting to develop may provide a place for research in this area as well. There are two challenges thrown up by psi research, that is parapsychology. One is directed at parapsychology itself, because why is it that parapsychology has not made the kind of progress in which? Parapsychology, scientific parapsychology, is as old as psychology itself. But today psychology is everywhere, and nobody questions it, but parapsychology is not. So there must be something wrong what we have done. The self-directed challenge is one of developing innovative strategies and research methods consistent with what appears to be the unusual nature of science. The challenge for science in general is to find room for science in its overall worldview. Science researchers and the community of scientists should be prepared to go to wherever the evidence leads. Now, we were accused by a Canadian psychologist who wrote in the same issue of the BBS journal, said these people have a hidden agenda. They talk like scientists. They talk the language of scientists. They use statistics and all the rest of it. But behind that is they are trying to prove the existence of soul. And parapsychologists who want to be respected as a legitimate scientist has to say, no, we have nothing to do with soul, consciousness, or mind, or whatever. We are dealing with natural phenomena. They are on the defensive. They have been on the defensive, which I think is again wrong. If the results do lead them to discover the soul, they should not fight shy to draw the conclusion warranted by the evidence. Just as they should not feel shy to say that all this research is wasted and useless if that is the case. This could be, if the evidence points to the existence of soul or something like that, this could be the most important discovery ever made in science. Now then, these are the two basic challenges. Now, I find the psychology of yoga, about which I spoke at some length yesterday, may have some answers. Certainly, it is immediately relevant. We have thus far called attention to some of the challenges posed by psychical research and consciousness studies to the currently dominant paradigm of reductionist physicalism. Does yoga psychology, we discussed last evening, provide a viable model that would have explanatory power to deal with phenomena that appear weird and absurd from the perspective of biocentric reductive physicalism, without being at the same time inconsistent with the fruitful developments in neurobiology of consciousness. This is important. By asserting that these phenomena are real and the current psychology is not dealing with them, we are not questioning the enormous work current psychology has done and the importance of the knowledge that we have, how our brain works, how our brain functions, how the neurobiology can explain a great deal of our behavior. These are two separate. Asserting this is not denying that. But denying this, you are understanding human beings only partially, with the result we have the gap. As we interpreted Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, and you may note that the third chapter in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras deals almost exclusively with siddhis, extraordinary human abilities. The yogin's journey is from knowing to being. This I will explain a little later what it means. This journey appears to involve achieving the basic levels of excellence in all areas. The yogin's journey begins in systematically sharpening her mind by exercising control over its functions so as to overcome biases and thus come progressively closer to perfection and truth. This is accomplished by practicing concentration and cultivating the mindset of detachment and dispassionate. It's called the Kriya Yoga in the first chapter of Yoga Sutras. The practice of concentration combined with the detachment leads to excellence in sensory knowing and rational thinking. So yogi is not necessarily someone who is dogmatic or irrational or doesn't care for reason. No, he starts with reason and thinking. But he is progressively led to cognitive excellence, which is excellence in transactional knowing, as I defined yesterday, which is both sensory and rational. Continued practice of concentration gives the yogi not only the ability to understand how the mind works, but it also enables her to gain control over its functions. With the control gained to suppress normal cognitive functions, there arises intuitive realization of truth, which may be seen as accessing consciousness as such. In other words, first you develop with sharpening your mind and thus gain control over your mind. And once you gain the control over your mind, you enter into a different domain, epistemically a different domain as it were, because from reason you move on to intuition. In the journey, the yogin encounters a variety of extraordinary phenomena because the mind is now in a state to realize intuitions emanating from consciousness as such. The extraordinary phenomena may be recognized at three distinct levels. At the level of transactional knowing, it is cognitive excellence, leading to spurts of creativity, gush of genius, and the extraordinary feats exhibited by chain prodigies. Phenomenon like phenomenon of Raman. At the second level, we find transcognitive phenomena, which are ordinarily considered paranormal. The siddhis like telepathy and clairvoyance and precognition. They involve intuitive, non-sensory motor excellence converted into cognitive forms. The third level of excellence involves total transcendence from sensory awareness and rational thinking. At this level, knowing becomes being. This is the central thesis. Knowing becomes being. For this reason, this level may be called transcendental being, which involves the transformation of the person to realize truth in her being and thus becoming perfect. To becoming perfect is to live truth in one's own life. Prolonged practice of concentration gives one the ability not only to understand how the mind functions, but also to gain control over its functions. With the control and suppression of its normal cognitive functions come special states of the mind that open up new possibilities and potentialities. Instead of sensory knowing, there arises intuitive realization, which consists in accessing consciousness as such. Yoga psychology presents the trident, the trishul model of the person. The person is considered the composite of consciousness, mind, and body. While consciousness connotes a variety of meanings and admits of different interpretations, it is in the final analysis an irreducible and fundamental aspect of reality. In yoga, it is called Purusha. We call it consciousness. Consciousness as such is ineffable, non-intentional, and non-relational. It has no form or appearance. It is undifferentiated subjectivity. Knowing, feeling, and being go together, undifferentiated in consciousness as such. Thus, consciousness is Sat, Chit, and Ananda, all the three rolled into one. It is self-luminous as well as a source of illumination to all minds. Consciousness is different from the mind. The latter is the active instrument of thought, feeling, and action in the person. Though primary, consciousness in a sense has a secondary role in the person. It is regarded as a witness and given the role of an observer rather than of an active player. Consciousness is reflected in the mind. The luminosity of the latter is, however, the function of the former. The mind is physical and evolves out of Prakriti. However, it is different from the body we see. It is subtle and verified matter. The mind does not generate consciousness. It simply reflects it. In the person, the mind is a flowing stream of thoughts, conscious as well as unconscious. Knowing, feeling, and being are seen in the mind as distinct. With its attributes of thinking, willing, and feeling, the mind becomes the knower, doer, and the experiencer. The mind, as I said yesterday, may be functionally distinguished into three components. The manas is the central processor that continually attempts to filters, analyzes, and assimilates inputs received from sensory sources. Ahankara is the ego function that appropriately processes inputs and engenders the sense of me and self-consciousness. Buddhi is that aspect of the mind which has the closest affinity to consciousness. The body refers to the brain, the nervous system, the senses, and the rest. The rest are supporting the physical structures. Senses are the external organs, while the mind also acts as the internal sense. The senses are the doors that enable the mind to make contact with the world of objects. The concept of sense refers to the instruments of knowing, jnanendriyas, as well as action, karmendriyas. The relationship between consciousness, mind, and body is not triangular, but linear. The mind is connected with the bodily processes at the one end and with consciousness at the other. Thus, the mind is the interfacing instrumentality and the connecting link between consciousness and body. The combination of the three in the body, mind, consciousness, trident model of the person, I think, has profound implications for understanding the functioning of human beings. Thoughts, feelings, and actions emanate from the sensory inputs, internally generated imagery, memory, and conscious and unconscious impressions and dispositions that include samskaras and vasanas. In as much as the mind is the active center of the cognitive, kinetic, and affective states, with the ego appropriating their effects, the person is predisposed to misconstrue the mind as the self and the center of her consciousness. The person, situated in a flux of constantly changing states of the mind, seeks identity and finds it in the ego, the binding factor that relates the knowing object to the person, and hypostatizes the ego function as the enduring self. This indeed is a congenital condition, often described as the primordial ignorance, in Sanskrit, avidya. There is another significant aspect to the CMB nexus in the person. Awareness as reflected in the mind is in some ways distorted. The reflection of consciousness is embellished in proportion to the imperfections inlaid in the buddhi, which is the reflecting surface of consciousness. Also, the buddhi is the seat of vasanas and samskaras, and thus a source that conditions and embellishes our perceptions. Further, the buddhi is saturated with the sensory inputs it receives and the internally generated images which acquire the characteristics peculiar to the processing instruments, the senses. Consequently, what is reflected in the mind is not consciousness as such. Rather, it is the concocted or constructed sensory image that is illumined by the reflection of consciousness. That is the basis. Now, accepting the fact that biases and distortions in the perception of the reality outside are built into the very process of our interaction with the world, it becomes necessary to remove the biases and correct the distortions so that we could come closer to knowing the world the way it really is. You will recollect, Kant said that we will never know things in themselves. We are cognitively closed. Yes, we are cognitively closed, but we can intuitively have access to them. The paradox of the psychophysical system is that, on the one hand, the mind embellishes one's perceptions and distorts the truth, while on the other hand, it is also an instrument that could help remove the biases and distortions and thus enable one to know the truth. So ultimately, the mind is not annihilated. The mind is purified to an extent that when reflections of consciousness, when consciousness is reflected in buddhi, which is pure, then you see consciousness the way it is, that's the way things are. Because all the embellishing things are confusion and elimination. As the Brahma-bindu Upanishad puts it, the manas is the cause of bondage and liberation to us. Bondage when attached to object of liberation, when free from it. Thus the mind is double-edged. It can elevate you or it can immerse you in darkness and ignorance. Practice of concentration and cultivation of vairagya not only help to make the mind steady and focused, they also lead the mind into a state of samadhi. Samadhi is not a single and all or none state. It involves several steps and states that progressively check the different functions of the mind from the mundane perceptual activity of the gross, subtle objects, reflection and recollection, feeling of joy and self-consciousness, to the highest state of pure consciousness where the mind is all purified and remains untainted buddhi. Continued practice of focused attention has three distinctive effects. First, focused attention leading to a state of samprajñāta samadhi gives cognitive excellence. by progressively controlling the biases that distort truth and embellish knowledge. Second, following the suppression of sensory content, a new source of transcognitive knowing becomes functional. It may be called intuitive realization, which makes the person realize non-sensory awareness. This involves not merely accessing consciousness as such, but also translating that awareness into cognitive content. Such knowledge is not completely devoid of all blemishes because the translation of the realized information into cognitive content entails its own limitations, including the built-in fallibilities of sensory processing. Third, beyond intuitive awareness is self-realization, which is accessing consciousness as such and staying in that state where knowing and feeling blend with being. This is the state of asamprajnata samadhi. On this BMC model, we may conceive of three types of cognitive excellence. In Vedanta, they are referred to as Shravana, Manana, and Nididhyasana. And I explained in some length yesterday what this means. Shravana, which literally means hearing, as we interpret it, includes all modes of observation that give us perceptual awareness. In those days, knowledge was in the Vedic time, orally transmitted, and therefore you hear the truth, whatever is in the Vedas, by this oral communication. But today, it's much more than that. Manana is raciocination. It involves reasoning, logical inference, induction, and other means of understanding the observed phenomena. Whereas Shravana gives us the information about the world, Manana makes us understand it. Manana may be considered the second order knowing, as it gives one mind-constructed cognitions. The third, Nididhyasana, involves knowing by being. It is the first order knowing characterized by intuitive insights that are self-certifying truths and manifest not as cognitive constructions, but as transformational phenomena, where knowing becomes being. It is, one would say, the final step in phenomenological reduction. Yesterday, one of our friends raised the question of Husserl, and I think this final step is not taken by Husserl, which yoga does. Thus, on this model, yogic excellence has three tiers. The first tier is observational knowing, the second is intellectual understanding, and the third is transformational realization of intuitively obtained truth by meditation or in meditation. It may not be unreasonable to interpret the three legs of samyama, or three steps of samyama, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, as exercises to achieve the three types of excellence. Dharana, concentration, alone gives observational excellence. Dhyana leads to excellence in understanding, and samadhi involves excellence in transformational learning. It changes the person, it converts the person, it transforms the person in accordance with the truth he or she had realized in her meditative state. Now, let us consider the BMC model and some other models. How does the BMC model of the person, which postulates the existence of mind, the consciousness as distinct from reducible and distinct from and irreducible to brain and bodily states, differ from other postulations that psychology has come to reject? In fact, a similar model involving body, mind, spirit, soul, is very much in vogue in the Western tradition. Actually, it is older than the advent of Christianity. How does the BMC model differ from that? The BMC model, like the BMS model, rejects the notion that the brain generates consciousness. As Sri Aurobindo says, and I quote, "Body, brain, nervous system are instruments of consciousness. They are not its causes." However, here is the difference. The BMC model, derived from yoga psychology, differs from the Western BMS models in two important ways. First, the conception of mind in yoga is very different from the Cartesian conception of mind. Second, Indian model is rooted in practices and is geared to be practical and applied, whereas the Western approach is a largely speculative armchair cognitive exercise. See, Western science is very practical when it comes to material things. When it comes to spiritual things, it only stops with being speculative. Whereas in the Indian tradition, even spiritual things are translated into practice. I think this is the difference. In yoga theory, the mind evolves out of matter and finally dissolves itself as it returns to its primordial state in proportion. This dissolution of mind, in a sense, is evolution to another dimension. Thus, in addition to the biological evolution, we may conceive of psychic evolution. The latter is the progressive undermining of the mind's biological link and its transformation into pure and untainted buddhi, which is nearly indistinguishable from Purusha. This is a very important sutra in Yoga Sutras. Purified buddhi is almost indistinguishable from consciousness as such. That is the beauty of it. Sri Aurobindo develops the notion of psychic evolution in his concept of supramental. He calls such an evolution nature's method of self-transcendence, the first indispensable step in an upward evolution. We are told further, we would be to evaluate the first indispensable step in an upward evolution would be to elevate our force of consciousness into these higher parts of mind, from which we already receive, but without knowing the source, much of our larger mental movements, those especially that come with a greater power and light, the revelatory, the inspirational, and the intuitive. Sri Aurobindo suggests that psychic evolution involves a series of identifiable steps. He conceptualizes them as 1, higher mind, 2, illumined mind, 3, intuitive mind, 4, overmind, and 5, supermind. Unfortunately, these words are not sufficiently make a sufficient distinction between different states. And I think all of us know how difficult it is to distinguish them. These successive self-transmutations, as he calls them, are domains of being, grades of the substance and energy of the spiritual being. The higher mind is the beginning of ascendance from conceptive and ratiocinative mind away from logic and inference to manifestation of self-existent self-awareness. Thoughts in this state arise not as conclusions drawn from premises, but as self-revelatory wisdom. Higher mind involves not only entry into a transcognitive state in the form of revelatory knowing, but it also brings about volitional and affective transformations in the person so that her feelings and actions become the vibrations of this higher wisdom. In the higher mind, the revelatory wisdom is in the form of ideas, thoughts. As the higher mind evolves into illumined mind, the revelatory wisdom is transformed from the ideational mode to the perceptual mode. This involves a higher ascent in the realm of consciousness and powerful descent in the ordinary world of the mind, which comes not merely as an idea of truth, but its vision accompanied by a fiery order of realization and a rapturous ecstasy of knowledge. Unquote. Sri Aurobindo tells us the thought in itself, in its origin, on higher levels of consciousness, is a perception, a cognitive seizing of the object of some truth of things. The revelatory wisdom of the higher mind and the illumined mind are derived from the mind's ability for intuition. Intuition is the realization of truth inlaid in consciousness. The intuition manifests as an idea in the higher mind and as a vision in the illumined mind. With the evolution of intuitive mind, which represents the third level of intuitive wisdom, truth manifests in a relationship of identity. The consciousness of the subject meets with the consciousness of the object. This close perception is more than sight, more than conception. It is the result of a penetrating and revealing touch which carries in it sight and conception as part of itself or as its natural consequence. It is a state of concealed or slumbering identity, as Sri Aurobindo puts it, with its overwhelming and automatic substitute. Sri Aurobindo recognizes that in life, pseudo-intuitions occur along with genuine intuitions. The former, the seeming intuitions, are in reality communications rather than intuitions. They arise not from consciousness, but from darker regions of the mind. Because of their misleading nature and similarity with the genuine intuitions emanating from consciousness, we are inclined to use reason to validate intuitions. But this largely discounts for us the utility of intuition, because the reason is not in this field a reliable arbiter. An intuition passed in judicial review by the reason ceases to be an intuition and can only have the authority of the reason, not of intuition. True intuition, according to Sri Aurobindo, has fourfold potentialities. One, it has the function of revelatory seeing of truth. Two, it has the significance of inspiration of hearing truth. Three, it also involves truth touch, which enables one to immediately see its significance in one's being. Finally, intuition enables one to clearly discriminate and realize orderly and exact relation of truth to truth. The overmind is the next stage in the evolutionary ascent of the mind. It is accompanied at the same time with the descent characterized by the subordination of the sense of ego and its eventual abandonment. It involves the horizontal expansion of the self, resulting in perception of feeling of a boundless universal self, which again is a common mystical experience. In this expanded awareness, the separate ego as well as instrumental individuality may entirely disappear. The personal mind when felt, would manifest as a field encompassing others and their unity with oneself. It involves no less than transformation of the person into a universal individual. The universal individual is one who identifies herself with all things and beings, with the thought and sense, the joy and the grief of others. There is an inclusion of being in oneself and the reality of their life as part of one's own being. You can see the relevance for the competitive, cutthroat, exploitation that we see today has to do play something different in order for us to live happily on this planet. The overmind thus indicates the emergence of the sense of transcending the ego and individuality and the experience of identity with others. In a sense, the person in a state of overmind is in a transitory state of discovering the true individual, replacing the dead ego. Sri Aurobindo tells us that the overmind, though a very high achievement of evolutionary development, is still the mind and acts like mind, admitting division and plurality while recognizing the underlying unity. Further, with the emergence of the overmind, there comes no assurance that it stays there or goes beyond, because it is built on the shaky foundation of evolving matter and is subject to its rollback. Only the evolution of the supermind can help to transcend the pull of the material basis of the mind. Supermind, in Sri Aurobindo's view, is indescribable and ineffable because it is more like consciousness as such. Different from the consciousness manifesting in the different states in the mind's evolution, in the supermind, all is self-known luminosity. As you have seen, I have spent some time trying to find Sri Aurobindo's work, a sort of clarifying some of the issues involved in our model. The higher mind shuts itself off in the sensory inputs as it opens its doors to intuitive ideas emanating from consciousness as such. Now, what are the implications of this mind? Now, I can go on for another 15 minutes, but I think I would want to leave some time for questions. But I think they are very obvious. The basic asymmetry that we've found as the source and cause of the present day trouble, the progress of physical science and the lack of progress of human sciences, can be remedied if we pursue this model. Unless we try going in this direction, we cannot stop the progress of physical sciences. If we do, then we can live in peace, perhaps. But that we have gone far enough and fruitfully enough that this is something the race is going to go on. But we must also at the same time have a conception of who we are, so that we can study that aspect of human nature to evolve a strategy, to evolve humans to a degree that they can cope responsibly with the enormous potentialities made available to them by the progress of physical science. Otherwise, it is like giving an atom bomb to a blind man who do not know what to do and runs around and finally drops somewhere. So in order to avoid that, I think psychologists and others involved in human science research must look at human nature as something more than a brain-driven machine. There is something behind it. Call it spiritual, call it consciousness, call it whatever you like. There is something hidden that we have ignored and left out. Let us awake ourselves from this deep slumber, awake ourselves to the reality of this truth, without which, I'm afraid, we will continue to run blind, and we are going to hit our head against the wall so badly that there will be no head left. Thank you.
Purified buddhi.
You see, the mind in the Indian tradition, especially yoga tradition, consists of buddhi as well as sattva. Buddhi consists of sattva as well as rajas and tamas. Rajas and tamas are the ones which help to embellish the mind. And therefore, the purified mind